Today it's a pleasure for me to come speak with you about skin cancer and sunscreen. And it truly is a dilemma. Sunscreens have altered the ancient relationship between our skin and the sun. And we'll explore the consequences of how that's happened in this presentation today. But before I begin, I want to acknowledge my colleagues in this exploration of this dilemma. Dr. Frank Garland, Dr. Cedric Garland. It's been my privilege and joy to work with them for the last 25 years, and it's been an amazing journey. And also Mr. Sharif Moore, who's a brilliant data analyst, a gifted writer, and he's here in the audience today as well. Now, some of you may have noticed this rather odd creature in the middle of the slide. This is our UCSD sun god. He came to the campus. I think it's emblematic of our discussions today. He came to the campus in 1983 and immediately caught the students' interest. They have an annual ceremony they call the Sun God Festival now. And in fact, they perform these rituals every year. They bring bands, they play exotic music, they dance in strange ways. And at the close of the ceremony, the sun continues its ascent into the summer sky. The students, being bright undergraduates, realize that there must be a causal relationship, so they repeat the ceremony the next year. As with previous speakers, I have nothing to disclose, no proprietary relationships with the sun. The objectives of our discussion today will be to describe the epidemiology of cutaneous malignant melanoma, or as doctors call it, melanoma, in terms of person, place, and time. These are the key epidemiologic variables, the triad. Who gets the disease, where does it occur, and how has it behaved over time? By the end of the presentation, we'll be able to identify risk factors for melanoma that include individual and behavioral risk factors, and also environmental risk factors, atmospheric risk factors, and risk factors that might be associated with lotions in our environment. We'll be able to differentiate between two kinds of ultraviolet irradiance, UVA and UVB. And you notice I don't call it ultraviolet light. That's because it's invisible. That reminds me a bit of the story of the busy receptionist in the psychiatrist's office. She ran in and said, "Doctor, there's a man in the waiting room who says he's invisible." The doctor looked up and said, "Tell him I can't see him." We'll never know if that patient was truly invisible, but clearly ultraviolet A and ultraviolet B light irradiance are not detectable by the human eye. We'll also, I want to underscore the importance between primary and secondary prevention in melanoma. And this may seem a simple discernment, but the National Cancer Institute and the American Cancer Society are really fixated on secondary prevention. So we'll contrast these two approaches to disease prevention. And finally, by the end, we'll make recommendations for the primary prevention of malignant melanoma based on its epidemiology. Now, screening is, of course, an example of what kind of prevention? Excellent. And here's a typical lesion. It exhibits the asymmetry of melanoma. The border is irregular. It has what's called the flag sign, red, white, and blue coloration, and a diameter of greater than 6 millimeters. A dime has the diameter of about 18 millimeters, just for contrast. And screening for melanoma is not that difficult. It takes the doctor about 5 minutes unless the patient has a lot of freckles. And it's not colonoscopy. It's pretty easy. So we do recommend secondary prevention for melanoma. But it's much better to prevent the occurrence of the disease in the first place. Where does melanoma occur? Well, on the integument, of course. But where in the world does it occur? It's a disease of high latitudes. It's a disease of industrialized, highly developed economies. It's a disease of indoor office workers. It's not a disease of farmers, firemen, roofers. It doesn't have a clear relationship with sun exposure the way squamous cell cancers do, for example, or actinic keratoses. This shows the global burden. I'm sorry to say there are 160,000 cases of melanoma in the world each year and 41,000 deaths. You can see the high rates in Australia, New Zealand, Northern Europe. Pigmentation is, of course, a risk factor for melanoma. It's a protective factor. Constitutive pigmentation is the strongest protective factor we know of for melanoma. That and the ability to tan. The ability to tan is interestingly blocked by sunscreens. Now, how's the disease behaved over time? Well, these are data from Connecticut. These are the rates in women. This is one of the oldest registries in the world. It goes back to 1935. These are age-adjusted rates. This is the incidence in women. Here's the incidence in men. And unfortunately, melanoma is the most rapidly increasing incidence of any malignancy. So what is it about this? We don't think it's a particularly migration effect. Connecticut's pretty stable. We don't think there's any genetic explanation. The genes just don't change this quickly. Our group looked at solar flares, sunspots, and this chart shows peaks in solar flare activity, and we couldn't discern an association. People have been looking at sunspots for a long time, even earlier than 1750. It's the way Galileo lost his eyesight in the late 1620s, I believe. So there are a lot of people looking at the sun. This is from the Cancer Registry of Norway. It's more recent data, not as long a time period, but a very startling increase from 2 to about 20, so almost a tenfold increase in incidence in Norway. Norwegians, of course, are very lightly pigmented. These are age-standardized incidence rates, the British spelling, of course, because it's from Great Britain. And you can see the rates increasing in both men and women from 2 and 4 up to 12. So maybe threefold overall. Again, no clear relation to solar activity. This is in Australia, and Australia has astoundingly high rates of melanoma. In the 1980s, they were over 20. Now they've reached 45 in men in men and a little less in women. This is despite a very aggressive campaign of sunscreen advocacy, and we'll look at that in more depth. These are melanoma incidence rates in Scotland, and of course people are very fair in Scotland. We don't think this is a genetic relationship. It's things haven't changed that quickly in Scotland. When I look at this, I'm reminded of the story of the slow night in the Scottish tavern. It was actually a very slow night in the Scottish tavern, and there were only 2 customers at the bar. One turned to the other and he said, after several hours, "Can I ask you a question?" The other one said, "Sure, why not? Why not? Tell me, where are you from? Are you from Aberdeen or Edinburgh?" "Well, Aberdeen, actually." "Is that so? Is that so?" "Yeah. I got family in Aberdeen." "No. Do you now?" And just then the phone rang, and the innkeeper answered, and it was his wife. And so the innkeeper said, "No, dear, no, it's a slow night. The McTavish twins are drunk again." So it was clearly a temporary inhibition of short-term memory induced by alcohol caused the McTavish twins to fail to recognize their genetic association. But we don't think there's a genetic association going on here in Scotland. Now here are rates in Hawaii, and I'd like to point out the contrast between the high rates in the whites living in the islands and the low rates in the Asian Pacific Islanders. And this points out the power of constitutive pigmentation in melanoma prevention, reduction of incidence. Now I just want to orient you to the spectrum. You've probably seen some of the badges that have the rainbow, the red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. Roy G. Biv, right, Greg? That's how you remember the rainbow. And then, but look at the breadth of the UVA portion of the spectrum. This, on the vertical axis, you see the fluorescence, irradiance in joules per square centimeter per day. There's a lot of energy in UVA, and just a very little sliver in the UVB. And that's, of course, where all vitamin D photosynthesis occurs. And it's also the portion of the ultraviolet spectrum that's completely blocked by photochemical sunscreens. The sun is, of course, the source of UVB that's used to make vitamin D. And you can see a sunspot on this photograph from Stanford. Less than 1% of solar radiation is UVB. Approximately 4 moles of UVB photons are required to produce 1 mole of cholesterol, 7-dehydroxycholesterol. And if you want to know more about the physics, the particle physics of that, I'd like to refer you to Leo Baggerly, who's made a detailed study of it. When a photon opens this ring, pre-vitamin D is formed, and then the warmth drives this reaction forward in the skin to form cholecalciferol, or vitamin D3, the common form in supplements. This is a diagram of how this reaction occurs in the skin. Ultraviolet light forms pre-vitamin D. The warmth drives the reaction forward. Vitamin D3, cholecalciferol is formed. It goes to the liver where it's hydroxylated, and it's been pointed out that's the main circulating form of 25-OHD. And then that's converted in the kidney and various other organs to calcitriol, or 125-dihydroxy vitamin D. Now, in vitro studies have found that melanoma in tissue culture, human melanoma cell lines, respond to 25-OHD and 125-dihydroxy vitamin D. It inhibits their growth, and it maintains them in a better differentiated state. It inhibits their growth substantially, up to 60%. And Gruber and associates have found that this effect is dose and time dependent. In other words, the more 25 or 125 you add to the Petri dish, the greater the effect. And there's an effective duration as well, concentration and duration. So from our friends in the lab, we move to epidemiology, my favorite topic. This is a study from Marianne Berwick and associates. She's found that solar elastosis, a marker of sun exposure, was associated with a 60% increase in survival in patients with malignant melanoma, a hazard ratio of 0.4, highly statistically significant. As sunburn and a history of high sun exposure was also associated with increased survival. These factors would also be associated with higher serum 25-hydroxy vitamin D levels. We don't know from this study the serum levels, but it would be worth examining. This is some results I love to share because they're from the National Cancer Institute. One of the co-authors, Margaret Tucker, is a strong proponent of sunscreens. But she was involved in this study that looked at dietary intake of vitamin D and in cases and controls and risk of melanoma, the association with melanoma. And she found that people in the highest quintile, the highest fifth of intake at 158 IU or more had approximately 40% lower risk of melanoma as people in the lowest. And you can see how low that intake is in the lowest group. That's about half a glass of milk, 58 IU. And even at this very narrow range of intake, there's a very strong effect of dietary vitamin D, and And it is significant. There was also a statistically significant trend across these quintiles. This is adjusted for several factors: age, race, sex, number of nevi, and skin response, which is a marker of skin type. Now, of course, ultraviolet B varies by solar angle, and that changes with season, latitude, and time of day. What we see here is a picture at the equinox, the equinoctial picture. The sun is directly over the equator, and the path length is approximately 40% longer at 45 degrees north latitude than at the equator. Ultraviolet B is very delicate, and it's removed differentially through a thicker atmosphere. You can also see, we call this the flashlight beam model, that as the sun, if you shine a flashlight straight against a wall, for example, the ring will be circular. But if you move it to an oblique angle, then the energy is spread across a greater area. And this is also a factor. You can imagine if the sun was down over the Tropic of Capricorn at 23.5 degrees south, that would be even a stronger effect. So this is how ultraviolet B varies by season. And you'll see fluctuations by season from N. Haynes data that Dr. Frank Garland will show later today. This is the total ozone measuring satellite, or TOMS satellite study findings. And a lot of people say epidemiology isn't rocket science, but Bill Grant is here. He's a rocket scientist. And these are results from the TOMS satellite. And what you can see is that ozone varies dramatically around the world. And over Antarctica, you see the ozone hole, the famous ozone hole. What's less publicized is this ozone lip, the very thick 400 Dobson units in thickness. 10 Dobson units at sea level is 1 millimeter in thickness. And Dobson did a lot of work in the 1920s on ozone before it was popular at Oxford, so they named these units after him. But there's a big range, 200 to 400. And so we were able actually to look at this pattern in terms of melanoma. And what you can see across the horizontal axis is that the thicker the ozone, the higher the age-adjusted incidence of melanoma in these 36 industrialized countries. Australia and New Zealand are actually off the chart. They have such a thick ozone and high incidence rates. But there's a very good relationship. In fact, you can predict 30% of the variation in melanoma among these countries simply by knowing the ozone in Dobson units, the ozone thickness. Ozone is a large triatomic molecule that absorbs ultraviolet B. It vibrates at a frequency that allows it to absorb ultraviolet B. So it functions exactly like a sunscreen. This is the coefficient. Pigmentation, of course, the more pigmentation, the lower the risk of melanoma. And here's ozone, which is positively associated with melanoma, as we'd expect. And our pigmentation data in this study came from a husband and wife team, Jablonski and Chaplin, who went around with reflectometers and measured constitutive pigmentation under the arm of people in a sample of countries. So we can actually adjust these findings for pigmentation, and the ozone relationship persists, and actually the prediction is stronger. Now we can predict 43% of variation in malignant melanoma, knowing these two variables, ozone and pigmentation. Now I'd like to turn to odds ratios of sunscreen use and malignant melanoma. These are results from 16 case control studies. 4 of them found a protective association, and 5 had no statistically significant relationship, but 7 found a increased risk of malignant melanoma associated with sunscreen use. Well, our group hit on a kind of happy idea of looking at these studies. You can organize them by an odds ratio like this, or by the author's last name, or by the date, whatever you like to do. But we decided to organize them by latitude. And what we found when we did that is that studies done in high latitude countries tended to show a negative relationship. The people who had melanoma reported more frequent use of sunscreen. So what we determined from that is that there may be some underlying effect, and that perhaps it's pigmentation, and that the people who are using sunscreen are more vulnerable to melanoma because the sunscreen maintains their skin in a transparent state. And then as you go down toward below 40 degrees, you see the effect in the opposite direction, or null effects. And this may be just because if you're pigmented, the sunscreen doesn't matter at all. And people who have melanoma might tend to just report that they didn't wear enough sunscreen. That's a form of recall bias that we're acutely aware of in epidemiology. But this was a remarkable finding, and my colleagues and I published it. And it seems to us that the people who are using sunscreen are precisely the people who shouldn't. It turns out you can predict variation in these odds ratios by just knowing the latitude of the country, which is a proxy for pigmentation. Well, how does the human photoprotective response work, and how do sunscreens louse it up? Here's a diagram of the thickening of the stratum corneum. Here comes the UVA, a lot of it. And there's the UVB, just a tiny little bit. But the UVB is stimulating keratinocytes to secrete melanocyte-stimulating hormone that in turn makes the melanocytes secrete melanin. And what happens is the stratum corneum thickens. The melanocytes produce more melanin. This is the brown melanin, the U melanin, that's very effective in blocking ultraviolet B. A lot of people have pheomelanin too, that's a little reddish in U. And here you can see it spreading. And now, UVA and UVB can't reach down into the deeper layers. Well, this is the human photoprotective response that we've evolved over millennia. And the ability to tan is a highly protective factor in melanoma. Sunscreens inhibit this. It's interesting that melanosomes actually migrate in response to UVB to the apex of the nuclei, where they sort of huddle around to protect the nucleus and the DNA. This is the distal, the outside skin is at the top, and there's the apices of the nucleus. Now, sunscreens have been around for quite some time. You may remember the tan, don't burn, copper-toned girl and the dog who pulled down the back of her bathing suit. They used to be called suntan lotions, and they weren't nearly so strong. But homosalate and para-aminobenzoate were actually introduced in the 50s, late 40s and 50s. Then PABA and SPF around 8. Now we have higher erythema blocks coming, 20 to 35 SPF, simply a ratio of how much longer it takes to get burned. If you would get burned in 1 minute, it would take you 35 minutes. If you get burned in 10 minutes, it would take you 350 minutes if you were wearing this sunblock. It blocks the photo accommodation. Now, correlation isn't causation. We're acutely aware of that, but there is no causation without correlation, as Sharif Moore has pointed out to me. Here's the date of the introduction of homosalate. Here's PABA. There's some of the higher erythemal blocks. And that's kind of an interesting picture. Now I'd like to turn to some results from Richard Setlow. There is one animal model of melanoma. It's a swordtail platy, a very attractive fish. And he accidentally exposed his swordtail platies to UVA. He covered them with a piece of plastic that blocked the UVB. And he discovered that his swordtail platies were getting melanoma. And it's probably today still the best animal model. So you can see here actually is the, this is the absorption spectrum of PABA. And here's the solar irradiance. So actually, this slide is designed to show you how PABA blocks in the heart of the UVB rather than, and also even out in the UVC, but not in the UVA. I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Here's the fish. This is the action spectrum for melanoma induction in the swordtail platy by UVA. And then there on the side is the absorption spectrum of PABA. So you can see that para-aminobenzoic acid, a common sunblock, isn't doing much to inhibit UVA, which will induce melanoma in fish. And we also think UVA is a potent carcinogen in humans. It generates free radicals. It causes oxidative stress in cells. UVB does also form mutations, but it forms specific kinds of mutations, thymidine dimers, that we've evolved repair mechanisms for, a light and a dark repair mechanism. So there's every reason to think that UVA could be the main culprit, the main carcinogen in malignant melanoma. And there's PABA absorbing the vitamin D producing part of the spectrum. Now, this is actually methoxycinnamate, which is another common chemical sunscreen. And you can see the absorption spectrum of methoxycinnamate in various solvents here. And please note that it's absorbing in the UVB, and it's transparent to the UVA, which it goes way out to 400. And remember that most of the UVA energy is close to the purple light that we can see. So it's missing most of the ultraviolet. It's a very popular sunscreen. Now it takes these UVB photons and it ends up fluorescing them in the UVA. So it takes the vitamin D forming photons, absorbs their energy, and fluoresces in the UVA, much like day glow paint takes ultraviolet A and then fluoresces in the visible light that we can see. And that's why day glow paint has that preternaturally bright appearance even in the evening or at dusk. So this methoxycinnamate is actually taking UVB energy and transforming it into UVA by fluorescence. Here's our friend PABA, para-aminobenzoic acid, absorbing right in the heart of the UVB, and again, fluorescing in the UVA. Pretty powerful chemicals. It's amazing they haven't been better tested. I think if they were pills and you swallowed them, the FDA would have asked for randomized controlled trials. But there are no randomized controlled trials that demonstrate that sunscreen or suntan lotion is effective in preventing melanoma. And in fact, it might be just the reverse. This is the big hope for the suntan industry, Mexerol, which is the new compound. And it does, I got this from their industry publication. It turns out that it absorbs in the UVA, but very far into the UVA, in the far UVA, not close to the purple light. So it's got a big hole right near the purple light. About 80% of the ultraviolet energy can still get through. It doesn't absorb as much in the UVB, but Mexerol takes that UVA energy and actually fluoresces in the infrared, so it feels warm on your skin. When it has to do something with that energy it's absorbing. It's always mixed with another sunscreen because it doesn't block a lot of the UVB, and people would buy it and they'd still get a sunburn, so they'd take it back to the store and say, this isn't working. In fact, it probably isn't. Now, here is some data. Again, I'll caution you that correlation is not causation, but these are data that you've seen already from the Connecticut Tumor Registry, and their annual sunscreen sales in millions of dollars. Just contrary. Could be coincidence. Now, the American Academy of Pediatrics just raised their recommended level for babies from 200 to 400 international units of vitamin D. But they also insist that you smear your child with sunscreen before you let them go out and play. And these are the actual recommendations. 30 minutes before going outside, even on cloudy days. SPF at least 15. So are they exacerbating vitamin D deficiency in children? Could be. Yeah, I think they are. There's the copper tone girl. She's still around. So in terms of primary prevention of malignant melanoma, should we minimize UVA exposure but allow some UVB exposure? It'd be good if we could do it. If skin type allows, maybe we should advise 5 to 10 minutes a day between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. precisely the time the dermatologists tell you to stay inside. That's the time that the UVB ratio is highest, the UVB to UVA ratio. There's always more UVA than UVB, but the UVB ratio, the UVB to UVA ratio is highest between 10 and 2. And that's the time when you can make a lot of vitamin D. In Australia and New Zealand, maybe we have to advocate supplementation because of the ozone mountain over southern Australia. I think we have to use sunscreens very cautiously, and only sunscreens that attenuate the entire UVA spectrum by at least 10 or 20 fold. Currently, the only compounds that do that are titanium dioxide and zinc oxide, compounds that are opaque. And we know that they're reflecting the UVA because they're reflecting the visible light. We shouldn't expect clear chemical sunscreens to reduce our risk of melanoma, rather rely on hats, clothing. And perhaps it's time to replace the erythemal, much vaunted sun protection factor with a real measure of ultraviolet protection. Now, how do you gauge your vitamin D status? We've settled approximately on a target of about 60 nanograms per ml. That's the circulating level in lifeguards in La Jolla. And it seems physiologic to me. They usually just put a little dab of titanium dioxide on their nose and they wear a hat. They're not fond of sunscreens. A useful rule of thumb that's been mentioned is for every 100 IU of vitamin D3 ingested, you'll gain approximately 1 nanogram per ml in serum, 25 OHD. So you can get your level up to, if you start out at 25, the median, according to Ann Haynes, you can get your level to 45 by taking 2,000 IU per day and still be within the no adverse effect threshold of the Institute of Medicine. 25 nanograms per ml is the estimate from the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. They're very careful. They try to get representative sampling. They go to neighborhoods, they take random samples, they oversample certain groups. But one thing they do that's a little distressing to me is in the winter, they sample vitamin D levels in the south, and then they go up in the summer to sample them in the north. So I think this 25 nanograms per milliliter is a pretty rosy or optimistic level. And there is seasonal variation though within N. Haynes, but it's probably attenuated by their sampling scheme, which I don't think is representative. And I doubt the true US median is anywhere near 25 nanograms per ml. Well, Donald forgot your sunblock. We don't know what wavelengths vampires are sensitive to, but Donald apparently chose the wrong sunblock. I'd like to close with some British school children who are wisely relying on some attractive red hats to prevent melanoma. They've gotten a little vitamin D, and you can see their pheomelanin, the red form of melanin in their skin, has been activated, and they're enjoying a sunny afternoon. Thank you.
Hi, Ed. I really enjoyed that. UV radiation, rather than light, generates vitamin D, but also destroys it. And I just wonder if there's any part of the UV spectrum that is better at destroying than at generating.
Well, the wavelengths for formation of vitamin D, thank you, David. Yeah, the wavelengths for formation of vitamin D are between 290 and 310 nanometers of wavelength. But this reaction does get saturated, and Dr. Hollick, of course, knows a lot about the chemistry of this. But it's after 15 or 20 minutes of irradiance, there's no longer formation. And you can probably tell you more about whether it's an equilibrium situation or is that what it is? Yeah.
Yeah, it is a photoequilibrium situation. I mean, the problem is that the amount of UVB coming in is about 1/100th to 1,000th the amount of UVA. And so when you're thinking about formation versus destruction, vitamin D will absorb UV radiation up to about 340 nanometers. So you have like 100 times more 335 nanometer radiation, which will not produce pre-vitamin D, but will destroy vitamin D. So there's an interesting kind of orchestration that's going on between formation and degradation. But the bottom line is that you can continue to make pre-vitamin D in your skin probably for about a half an hour to an hour. It really, again, depends upon the time of day, season of the year, latitude, and the like. But we've shown that in Boston, for example, you'll continue to make vitamin D in your skin in the summertime for about 30 minutes to 45 minutes.
Excellent.
Hi, Dr. Trump. Do you have any comments about the microparticularization of the zinc oxide or titanium oxide?
That's an excellent question. I was hoping someone wouldn't ask that. We've been looking at that, and these particles are so small. Their diameter. The question is about micro particles, titanium dioxide and zinc oxide. They disappear in your skin, and they're such small spheres. Their diameter is similar to the wavelength that they're designed to reflect, and it could be that they're scattering those wavelengths into the skin. So unless it's actually reflecting in a planar way the light, the visible light, I'm not sanguine about it, but I can't give you any definitive answer to that.
Can you refresh our memory about the distribution of melanomas over the body surface, and to what extent this differs from the clearly sun-dependent cancers such as squamous and basal?
Absolutely. Now, thank you, Dr. Haney, for that question. The melanomas generally occur in Caucasians, at least, on areas that are not normally sun-exposed. It completely in contrast to squamous cell cancers, actinic keratoses, and the like. They're also much more common in indoor workers than outdoor workers. They don't have their epidemiology is almost antithetical.
Hi, do you have any information about full spectrum lighting and how that affects, or what percentage of the UVB is in that, and is that a good therapy for people to recommend?
That's a great question. It really depends on the emission spectrum of the element, the bulb, or if it's a gas. Full spectrum lighting generally refers to the visible spectrum, and then and that certainly makes things look better. We've evolved to see in sunlight, and vision is better and colors are better. But if you do need to use a tanning lamp, and I think it's a reasonable approach if you live in Wasilla, Alaska, for example. You should seek out a UVB tanning lamp, or one that's very similar to the ultraviolet emissions of the sun. And don't rely on UVA. There is such thing as a UVA tan. It's a very strange tan. It takes the melanin that's in your skin and oxidizes it so that it gets a little darker. But it doesn't induce formation of new melanin. So I don't know if that completely addressed your question, but
I'm referring more to like the light box therapy.
For seasonal affective disorder and the like. Yeah, I think visible light definitely makes people feel better. It may be a melatonin mechanism, but David Fisher's been looking at Harvard's been looking at induction of endorphins by ultraviolet B light, and you can imagine where a mechanism like that might evolve, not for cancer particularly, but in prevention of rickets. If you can maintain a woman's bone health and she can make a baby and deliver it successfully, that would be strongly selected for. So there may actually be an evolutionary reason that we have endorphins in response to ultraviolet B light.
Could you comment on the NOVA had a program on about 3 weeks ago called The Dimming of the Sun, and it talked about the reduced UVB rays that were allowed through the pollution, especially in the daytime.
Oh, certainly.
How would that affect vitamin D? And I think particularly in alarmingly large amounts in parts of Europe, Russia, Israel, and in the Northeast United States.
Well, certainly atmospheric pollution is a big factor, and we've looked at differences in incidence between the Northeast in the United States and the Southwest in terms of cancers that are vitamin D associated. And there's a north-south gradient, but there's also an east-west gradient. And we attribute that to more ozone and also production of sulfur dioxide, which is quite like ozone. It's a triatomic molecule and also vibrates and absorbs in the UVB. So you can walk out in the sunshine and there's visible light, it'll look fine. You can feel the warmth, the infrared gets through okay, but there'll be no UVB in it. And we think that's the situation in Australia too, where there's this big mountain of ozone over southern Australia. So absolutely, just because it looks like sunlight doesn't mean it's helping you.
Hi, I'm Paula Luber. I'm from San Diego. And the question I have for you, we're seeing this huge epidemic of obesity in our kids. And I know there's an association, but not necessarily a causal one, between lower vitamin D levels in the obese. Do you think it's possible that part of the contribution to this obesity epidemic is the fact that we kept these kids slathered with sunscreen the whole time they were growing up? Wow.
Yeah, sure, an interesting idea, and now I've got something to do when I get home. I'll try to test that. It's very interesting when you look at NHANES data. Body mass index, the higher the body mass index, lower serum 25-OHD levels are. The greater physical activity, they unfortunately didn't stratify by indoor and outdoor physical activity either. Maybe NHANES 4 will do that, we can only hope. But the more physical activity, the higher the levels of vitamin D. So they may all just go together in a way. And I certainly like to see kids running around outside, getting some exercise and keeping their body mass index low. Body fat may also be a bit of a sink for 25-OHD, and I think Drs. Hollick and Haney could address that in a little more detail than I could.
Bill Grant with a couple of interesting comments based on your talk. First of all, elastosis seems to reduce the risk of melanoma, as he pointed out. They find out, for example, in Sweden that people get melanoma later in life on the face and the hands than they do on the trunk and the legs. But more interestingly, it turns out that smoking reduces the risk of melanoma. And that was first found, reported by the National Cancer Institute and confirmed by a Swedish person. And what I did was I took about 12 studies that looked at the incidence of cancer in populations and then plotted lung cancer versus melanoma. It was a straight line fit with an R-squared of 0.92. I mean, that's an extremely high correlation. It turns out that smoking, just like UV irradiation, induces elastosis, and it's harder for melanoma to grow in aged or wrinkled skin. So this is, it turns out, on the other hand, for squamous cell carcinoma and possibly for basal cell carcinoma, smoking increases the risk, and I think that's through free radical production. One other thing, if you, years ago I was challenged by dermatologists saying that ecological studies didn't really show that, I mean, you couldn't really believe them because how do you know that people live in a sunny location get more UVB and vitamin D? Well, I thought about using squamous cell carcinoma as the index of personal UVB exposure and vitamin D production, and showed that several cancers were inversely correlated with squamous cell. But it turns out this really only applies for latitudes equator at about 40 degrees. And if you're at higher latitudes, it's so cold and so little sun that you don't make enough vitamin D while you're getting your squamous cell carcinoma. But in Australia and Singapore and Spain, if you have enough exposure to the body in southern United States, that you can reduce your risk of internal cancers while getting a skin cancer, which you just have removed. And it's better than having an organ removed to just have part of the skin removed.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Bill. I'm glad to know there's some benefits to aging skin, but I'm not going to take up smoking.